So what we know as the as modern Afghanistan, I suppose, is for you, was it found by Ahmad Shah, or was it set up in a sense? The state was set up by Abdul Rahman.
Oh gosh, that's another big question. The dynasty that ruled what is now what was became known as Afghanistan was founded by Ahmad Shah Durrani, not because he was the first of his kind, but because he declared what we would call now independence, but he set up his own independent kingdom, basically his own independent emirate, um, which um, neither Safavid or Mughal or Uzbek could challenge. And in fact, he then proceeded to actually weaken those empires to such an extent that they collapsed, imploded.
And keep
Or
pillaging India.
yeah, well, and also, I mean, we have the chaos of after the fall of the Safavid Empire, chaos after the fall of Nader Shah, and the emergence of the Qajar dynasty. But they it took a while, many decades before they could really establish any kind of central authority. There was a lot of infighting there. So he was in a sense, it was an opportunist thing, but I mean, you find this all the way through history. One empire collapses and implodes, and somebody emerges somewhere else and takes advantage of that. Um, so if you talk about what Afghanistan, if you define Afghanistan by its ruling dynasty, then in a sense the kind of got the nationalist discourse that was created in the 20th century is probably has some validity. But I'm British.
Mm.
Um, my country of origin is not defined by its monarchy. It's defined by its people within its government. Despite the fact that our national anthem in Britain, all it talks about is the king or the queen.
Yeah.
So we have God save the king, God save the king, God save the king, make him victorious, happy and glorious, God save the king, God save the king. It's like as if you have to bang this into people's heads by repetition. It's like a child's nursery rhyme. It doesn't say anything about the people, its populations, its culture. Um, it's long as the king's okay and God's on his side, it's all right, mate. Um, she's all right, as they would say here in New Zealand.
Yeah.
New Zealand national anthem is very, very different. It also talks about God, but it talks about the protection of the people and his land, and um, you know, it's much more all-encompassing, as indeed a lot of national anthems are. So, if you define a nation purely by its monarchy, I think you're in serious problems, because it means that somehow or other, what the monarchy says, what the monarchy does, is the be all and end all. We have to define the country by its political structures, by its government, the nature of its government, and so on. Also, with the term Afghanistan, I mean, we find it being used primarily initially by British and European officials to describe a country that is ruled by the Sardozais, which doesn't actually have a name, because traditionally it was just called Daulat, or
Hmm. Government.
the government. So the country that when Elphinstone mission arrived in Peshawar to meet Shah Shuja in 1809. One of the things that Elphinstone, and I've written about this in the paper, Elphinstone he actually says that he found, to his surprise, as an enlightened man from the Enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment, that the country, inverted commas, of Shah Shuja didn't actually have a name, whereas he came from Scotland. Some of his associates came from Ireland, from India, so could be identified as Scottish, but the country that Shah Shuja ruled didn't have a name. Um, so he adopts the term Afghanistan, and this term is used by him in some slightly different ways And he tries to actually then tries to define his borders, because this is what you do in the Enlightenment world. You have
Yeah.
to draw lines in the sand. You have to reduce everything down to a statistic, to a theoretical premise, to a philosophical idea. And
Usually
so he
without disregard to what kind of populations live there or what kind of population will be divided.
Well, we have to remember that the officer mission was in Peshawar for about a couple of months. His sources were basically Qizilbash, the Qizilbash Ghulam Khanat, because they spoke Persian, and a few other traders and individuals, and also reference back to some of the early travelers. And we have to remember that there was very, very little travel literature available. In fact, one of the resources that Elphinstone Mission had that he took with him was a huge collection of books, which included most of the classical literature on Alexander the Great, the Ptolemaic geography. And being an educated Enlightenment man, he defined the country through that mirror and through those sources. So you look at the way in which they defined the frontier and they drew the map. It's all chaotic, and the whole thing kind of moves. There's no consistency in the analysis. And I talk about this in the paper that I wrote for the Elphinstone Mission conference that we had back in SOAS some years ago. And if people haven't read that, and if you're a scholar, you should really be reading that publication, those conference papers, because I think they're very revealing. So it comes down to, well, what do you call Afghanistan? I mean, as a nation state, it was recognized by the British government by treaty. I actually wouldn't know when the first time the word Afghanistan appears in a treaty between the Anglo-Afghan treaty. I'd have to go back and have a look at the sources there. Probably by about the 1830s, we're finding the word Afghanistan being used generally in European sources for the area ruled by the from that point onwards, from Dost Muhammad Khan and his descendants. I'm not a political theorist, so I can't. It's not my area of expertise, so I wouldn't know how you would define when a state becomes a state. When the name is given to it, or when it is recognized officially internationally. I would probably suspect it's international recognition, the fact that the treaty is being signed between the two states. So Britain's first treaty was with Dost Muhammad Khan after the first Afghan war. But even then, you find this strange thing, and I talk about this in the chapters dealing with the independence of Afghanistan. The British authorities in India was debating this thing. Well, are these treaties that we've signed with Dost Muhammad Khan, with Abdul Rahman Khan, Sher Ali Khan, all these arrangements that we've had in these aid memoir and these memoirs and things that we've signed and we've agreed at these different conferences, are these personal ones with the Amir? So in other words, are these just something that an arrangement that survives and that is legal until his death, and then after he dies, we have to then go and renegotiate these things or reconfirm it with his successor, or was it with the state? And this debate was actually never really, I don't think, ever really concluded in the British thing. And we find, for example, like the Dane mission in 1904, we find that the subsequent discussions after Amanullah Khan declares independence, this whole kind of debate just going on. And in the end, basically, Britain recognizes the Emir as an independent ruler with his own right to determine his own foreign policy. And could you say then that's when Afghanistan was first officially recognized? I don't know.
What you say is being, one side is a state, an empire, the other side is, the chief of a tribe power holder in space, in a space, in a geographical space. I mean, is that because is that a source of contention now? Because when they say, "Oh, the Duran line," we don't recognize it because of the way it was done.
Well, oh gosh, the Duran line. Well, that's God, that's another
Book to be
big
written on.
debate, isn't it? Well, I think the whole kind of thing goes back to, I think, to the Dawoodi era, when and the whole kind of emergence of the whole Pashtunistan idea of a unified Pashtun entity, um, which is ironic, because if Afghan and Pashtun are synonymous, as some claim, then Afghanistan actually is Pashtunistan. um, but one doesn't see the irony of that.
Every country has a founding myth, a founding narrative, a founding
Mm.
story to sell to its population, to rally the people around the flag.
Hmm.
Uh, but Afghanistan doesn't have one. And why do you see that?
I don't think you need a founding myth, to be honest. I think a nation is something bigger than the rhetoric that is pushed out by the government. I mean, we only have to look at one party nation states, and that they create their own myths. They write history according to how they want to see it, and then when they finally fall, they suddenly realize that actually that wasn't the case. Um, I think a nation is defined by its peoples rather than by its government necessarily, although its government plays an important part in at least should at least be working towards creating a sense of solidarity. But if you promote one particular ethnicity, for example, over the rest, and claim that this particular ethnicity has some sort of divine right to run this country, then in a sense you're pushing everybody else down into sort of second tier citizenships. Um, and I mean, again, I come from Britain,
Yeah.
and we've had this problem historically. If you go back, it's ironic because in Britain, of course, we actually had most of our kings were actually not British, in the sense they were not English, and we had the Normans, uh, and then we had the Welsh, then we had the Germans, um, and then the French. So does it really matter? Britain is being British and being English is something very, very different to you know, than than just being the monarchy.
Mm.
I think you have to develop a sense of cohesion, a sense of equality between different peoples, and it's something that I found. I'm going to be talking with another scholar, Afghan scholar, about this. I spent a lot of my time in Afghanistan in rural areas, doing a lot of work in rural studies, also traveling there for archaeological purposes and research problems. But I did a lot of work for NGOs in rural areas, in quite remote rural areas. We were up in Dar Nur, we worked in Khaki Jabbar in Kabul, we worked up in Maimana, Saripur, um, in the Upper Hari Rood, and community there functions, whereas very often at state level, there's a tendency to promote disunity and discord between different factions that are in charge. But actually, down on the ground in ordinary communities, you have people living cheek by jowl,
Mm.
who are forced by the fact that they share water, they share access, um, they share resources and have to work together to survive. You have a sense of community there, which is more how a state should function than you have at national level,
Mm.
where there's increasing emphasis on, oh, you've got to, we have this right and we have this right and we have that right, or, you have to be this kind of Muslim, or you have to be, so actually, my own feeling about Afghanistan is it actually functions very well, but at community level. And that doesn't mean there's not conflict and that there's not disputes. There are, but they have resolution systems that go on where people sit down and they have a shura or a jirga or a jalsa or whatever it is, and they
Yeah.
sit down and they have their own systems of putting these things to right. And I've sat in on these meetings as an observer, not somebody there telling them what to do, listening to these things going on, and they decide this is going to happen, this is going to happen. Okay, and by and large, it works. So, so I think it comes back to, well, what is Afghanistan? Is it just its government, or is it its peoples? I mean, do you define, let's take for example, the United States by its president, or by its Congress, or by its peoples? You know, I mean, as I say, I'm not a political theorist, but um, I think with the problem has been with government is that they've tended to not really understand what government means. There is this tradition of autocracy that has run through from the days of Muhammad Shah Durrani and further back, that is inherited partly from the Persian tradition, but also from the Mughal tradition. The sense that the central government should be dictating to everybody, what they should do, whether they should, wear pakals, or whether they should wear turbans, or whether they should wear fez or caracal hats, or,
Hmm.
whether they should come to the office in Perhan Tumban, or if they have to wear
Yeah.
bad fitting, Western suits. But at community level, things just go on. In fact, by and large, my experience is over many years is that by and large people don't really want the government to be involved, because they know that that's going to complicate things. There might be a problem of bribery. There might be an issue of people taking sides, and could actually disturb the indigenous systems of government.
So the Afghans have been quite unruly and libertarian in nature, I suppose, over the centuries per se. I mean, by Afghans, I mean people in that geography.
Well, I think the ordinary Afghans have a sense of place. They have a sense of identity, which is often different to what the government tries to promote.
Hmm.
I The idea of Afghans being unruly, which is interesting. This, I think, is very much a colonial myth. The idea of the sort of violent frontier, which we have to control because basically, these wild, crazy, drug crazed, you know, Ghazis are going to pour down out of the Hindu Kush and attack our civilization. It's very much a colonial construct from the British era, when they had to deal with the tribes of the Northwest Frontier, and they gave the British trouble, and in a sense they could say justifiably these people were occupying our country, trying to tell us what to do. So you could argue from both sides. Um, I actually don't think I think we need to forget Afghanistan as this kind of chaos, the center of chaos. It has been, but quite often the chaos has been created not by Afghans themselves, but by external forces. And I mean, you only have to look at the impact of the British invasions in the First Afghan War, Second Afghan War, and also British intervention into the sort of management of who runs the country, to realize that British policy in Afghanistan, particularly in the 19th century, was really very bad for Afghans.
Hmm.
It didn't serve them well, and it created more dysfunctionality than it created community. Unfortunately, it seems over the last, perhaps since the breakdown of central government, or perhaps even before that, there has become this emergence of this idea of particular peoples claiming particular rights to sovereignty, or particular rights to government, or who are emphasizing particular ethnicity, and that has all kind of contributed towards the breakdown of society. Any country, any nation state is full of different ethnicities. The big question is not who's meant to be in charge, but how can we get on together and live together without
Yeah.
killing each other?
I mean, you mentioned outside influence and colonialism there, and actually, I was talking to a friend who brought something to my attention which I had overlooked, I suppose, is when you talk about the Pashtun Belt and the expansion of the Pashtun Belt, you also, which follows is the internal settler colonialism that you talk about. Do you want
Mm.
to, have a bit of a go at that?
I think it's one of these kinds of words that gets bandied around, um, as if somehow or other this is sort of some kind of sort of kind of unified unity, polity. I mean, I'm not particularly an expert on on Pashtun communities and so on. I have worked with them, um, so I want to be careful. I don't want to upset anybody. But I mean, very much self-government is, and it seems to be the order of the day, as indeed it is in other communities. I mean, the Turkoman communities up in northern Afghanistan, um, they have very much sort of self-governing to all intents and purposes. And I think to a certain extent the Hazaras are as well, from what I gather. You have your own Chanda communities, and I think again it's part of the sort of wider promotion of ethnic rights.
Hmm.
Um, I can remember in Peshawar in the 80s and 90s when I was there talking to Pashtuns, mostly educated ones, who were really just horrified um, at the sort of the idea that we should be joining Afghanistan. um, because in their mind, whether this is just a colonial kind of carryover, they regarded Afghans the other side of the border as like, the government particularly is just like, we don't really want to have these sort of people here. They're wild, woolly. They're ignorant. They were quite demeaning, and in fact, one guy said to me, he said we hate the Taliban. And I said, I couldn't understand this. And he said, well, why? He said, well, because they give us a bad reputation. This was in the first read. And I mean, there are so many different strands in Pashtun society in terms of its political alliances. I mean, you have like the Red Shirts movement, which was an independence movement, but was very secular in some ways, very keen, engaged in education. You have the Islamist groups that want Islamization, and it's a very disparate thing. And I think you can't lump everybody together and just say, "Oh, you're Pashtun." Oh, like I can't say, "Oh, you're Hazara." I mean, well,
Hmm.
where are you from? Are you from Sheikh Ali? You may be from Yorakalan. You're from Yakalan. You may be from Molistan. Uh, you could be from somewhere in Kabul or in Iran. You could be from Saripul. So, each community has a definition, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're all the same. So I'm English, but I come from a particular background. Some of my English friends come from a very different background. They're public school educated, very well heeled, speak a different type of English to what I do. um, and most of the time we get on together. Most of the time. We have people with very different. I mean, I think for a state to survive, it has to recognize its multicultural nature. And I think perhaps that's one of the issues with the whole kind of Afghanistan thing is that it's accepted that it's multicultural, but under conditions providing that the monarchy or particular people have to be in power at the time, a particular ethnicity or whatever. So you can buy into the state, providing you acknowledge the fact that the supremacy belongs to us, not to you.
Yeah.
And I think coming back to the Pashtun, I mean, I talk about it in the book, and I talk about its origins, which go back actually not to Afghanistan, but to a guy in California,
Yeah.
who was the first person to promote it, and it kind of became it's become a bandwagon, I think, which is, I suppose, frankly unrealizable, because I can't see, the Pakistani allowing to lose a third of their population, a third of their nation, especially when there's a problem in Kashmir and And I think again it's a distraction because really what really needs to be focused on is the whole question about like how can we live together in the same space
Hmm.
within these borders together without the kind of social dysfunctionality that has been that has emerged over the last 30, 40, 50 years, some of which is rooted in this whole ethnic debate. I mean, there are other issues as well, economic and regional and so on. But I mean, and to me, it's sad that it seems to be that the kind of the ethnic thing seems to be becoming more prominent rather than less prominent. And I'd always sort of think, well, particularly amongst people who are exiles and are refugees, you're living in a community now where you're perhaps a stranger and you're lumped together as Afghan.
Mm.
So I mean, when I was in Britain, I was involved a bit in the refugee resettlement things, and to a certain extent in Christchurch when these Afghan refugees start to first arrive. I actually went and talked to the resettlement people there because
Yeah.
I was the expert, and they just said,
You
"Oh, they're
are,
all
absolutely,
Afghan."
you are.
Well, but they talked about it. These people are all Afghan, so they put them all in the same area, all got them together, and assumed that they were going to love each other.
Yeah.
And I actually gave them, I went and did a talk to them and met some of them. And I mean, you could not have got a more disparate community. It was extraordinary. There was some guy who said he was Tajik from Badakhshan. I think he was probably from Tajikistan. There was a woman who claimed that she was a descendant of, her father was sort of like something to do with the ambassador, bin Afghan ambassador to India, who spoke with an Indian accent. Yeah. There was Hazaras. There were very, very strict push. One guy who had been senior in the Rabbani government, whose daughters came along in with the hijab. Um, you could not have got that in that thing. You had like a microcosm of so many different communities, but for the resettlement people in New Zealand who really had no much idea, they were just Afghans, and they expected stick them in a room, help them, and they're all going to love each other, and
Yeah.
the tension was palpable. So I think there is this problem with again with this whole resettlement thing is the lack of understanding of what the nature of Afghan society is. But in the end, I think perhaps by being a refugee, or living outside of your own country, you're having to engage to a certain extent with other people from other ethnicities and other backgrounds. You meet Christians and Buddhists and Hindus and atheists, and your university education, it's very, very different, or school education. So I mean, I'm hoping that will kind of like rub off
Yeah.
and be recycled back into Afghanistan. That people will realize that actually we can accept difference, but still treat each other as human beings without demeaning each other, without dragging out ancient histories and stereotyping each other. But I don't know. I mean, I'm an outsider in that respect.
Given where we are and the current situation with women in particular in Afghanistan, I think, I'm not arguing that the Hazaras of the 19th century or after or before were more progressive than the Pashtuns of that era. You have Shah Shuja, for example, when he fled to the Darbar of Ranjit Singh. I mean, his wife was vouching for him
Mm-hmm.
with the Ranjit with the Sikh king. Uh, what I was really struck by reading the book was the place of women, for example, within the Hazaras, and you have a very there's an episode where where there are women playing very prominent role and
Mm-hmm.
taking the husband's place, and it
Yeah.
was not has. I mean, just let's talk about that a bit.
Yes, I mean, I tried to. Uh, yeah, I mean, there's this famous thing. I think it's Dost Muhammad Khan. He imprisons this Hazara man, ruler from somewhere up in the Hajigak area, and his wife is and his wife actually ends up running the place and actually fleeing from prison, escaping, and then she is pursued by those Mohammed's troops, and she turns around and she's got a gun and she fires on them and escapes. So we have these every so often these vignettes of these very strong women. And I mean, it's famously the one in the Sudozai, in the story of the early Sudozais, of this, the wife of one of the one of the Sudozai family, whose son is killed by the other son
Yeah.
over the issue of inheritance, and she then swears an oath that she would drink his blood, the killer blood, because she's killed her son. And everybody's panicking because without this son, there's no inheritance claim to the leadership of the Sudozai clan to be Mir Afghan.
Yeah.
And so everybody's like panicking on how are we going to solve this issue? Because this woman is saying, I'm going to kill this other son in vengeance and drink his blood. It's like an extraordinary story, and it's in the source. I mean, it's actually from a Persian source, reasonably contemporary. So he comes back. Eventually, he's called back, and there's this huge, like, big sort of jerk, and they all say, "What are we going to do? How are we going to do this?" So eventually, their honor is satisfied by the poor sod who had actually done the killing, who was an Uzbek. He was obviously one of the guards. Or one of
Yeah.
He'd been the one who chopped off the brother's head. He's the one that's killed. So and everybody's sort of like happy after that, and then she drinks his blood and everything like. So you have these incidents of these really, really strong women appearing, and I think I tried to find out more about it, and the one that I think the one myth I did debunk about strong women is Malalai.
Yeah.
And I could not find anything in any of the sources about Malalai, and her, this is this sort of, raising the banner like an Afghan Joan of Arc and rallying the troops when they're almost defeated. And there's nothing I can find in any source, and I actually don't even know when it first began. I suspect it's probably written into the histories back in the nationalistic stuff around about in the 50s or something like that. But she's become this sort of iconic figure. But in a sense, I think it's quite good. I mean, we have our myths, like the French have their Joan of Arc. We have our Elizabeth I. It's quite important to have those sort of examples of women who've done great things, even if they didn't actually exist, or if there's a myth around them. So I've tried to bring that out. I talk out in the introduction about. I mean, there is this misconception. I meet it quite regularly talking to people who don't really know much about Afghanistan. And the first thing they say to me is almost like, "Oh, Afghanistan! Oh, they're treating the women terribly." And I said, you get this impression that they've got this idea that all Afghan women are these sort of demure little, sort of housefraus who just sit down and just do everything that that they're told. And they'd obviously never met any Afghan women because they would have a very different point of view. And what they may not function in the public sphere, but they have huge influence within the family and in the background.
Yeah.
And I try and point out the role that women have in this. So they may have to go out and they might have to wear the burqa. But it's where their influence is very strong. It's within the family.
So it says there were, especially in the powerful families, there were key figures, I suppose, players within the Game of Thrones struggles.
Yeah, and I mean the women in the harem, in the Zanana, we find them. I mean, particularly like during the reign of Abdul Khan and Habibullah, the women there are the ones who are determining really who's going to succeed. and they're competing against each other. And there's this famous woman, Bibi Halima, who eventually loses the battle for the succession and ends up living in Haram Sarai in the Baghi Babur, basically, essentially under house arrest for the rest of her life. So the power plays that are going on within the dynasty, it's not just the men sitting there around saying, and who's going to succeed, that there's huge pressure put on them in the Zanona about who was going to be succeeding the king. So the role of women traditionally seems to be, maybe more in a back room thing, but they have a lot of influence. I mean, they have a lot of influence in families with determining marriage arrangements and things like that. I mean, I joked with one Afghan once. I said, "Well, who's the real power in your house?" And he said, "Me." And I said, "Okay, so in any institution, so for example, if you're in a jail, right, who's the person with the power? The person who's in the jail or the person who has the keys?" And he said, "The person with the keys." And I said, "Who's got the keys in your house?" "Oh, my wife."